Um, we're taking a few minutes to let people in because a whole bunch of people registered, and we want to give everybody a shot here. But I want Ted to take a minute to talk about fire to warm us all up. Um, when you see it, and you'll also see a picture of this in the brief slideshow in a minute. You'll see this beautiful art. Ted, tell them how you did the cover piece. Talk about pyrography and warm us up.
Well, pyrography in China, it's called um, fire needle embroidery, um, wood burning if you're working with wood. So I'm drawing with a hot wire. It's also called poker work in some parts of the world. Design being in small stoves. In a place in the stove, there might be a little, you would put wrought iron needles, like a knitting needle, and then draw with that. So wood burning, but I use it on paper and on fabric and some other materials as well. So pyrography is the word that covers all of that. But it's a wonderful way to draw. That's what I did. I'm working on that. The cover. It's a 2 inch thick piece of sycamore, and sycamore has it has some really wonderful aroma when it's burning. And so while you're working over it, it's on a flat surface. I'm sort of kind of by the fire, if you will. And so I'm smelling that and I'm kind of sensing that, experiencing that. But the wood itself, sycamore, was a common, it would have been the people's wood, would have been common for burning in those fires around like town squares, if you will. So it would have been a fuel that would have been accessible. So as I'm working on that cover, I'm imagining in the Gospel of Luke the many ways that he makes reference to fire and thinking about disciples warming their hands by fire, just the many ways that heat transforms that material. And anyway, it was a lot of fun in terms of working on it. It was one of those projects that was over way too fast. I was about halfway into it and I realized this just isn't going to take very long. I got lost in it very quickly, and you just sort of flow with with the grain itself. If you look at the cover, you can see that there's some striations there, and the lighter color burns a little bit faster than the darker color. So it's as if you were writing or drawing with a pen, and every once in a while the ink sort of has a mind of its own. So there's a bit of a dance with the heat, and kind of like roasting a marshmallow. Like you can get it right, and then you can get it wrong very quickly. But it was a lot of fun. I learned a lot about sycamore and about heat and fire along the way.
Thank you. I always know I can call on Ted, who's not only a great artist but a great preacher. He's always good at hominem, and I love to hear him talk about his art. Chris, if you want to put me on full screen, people will be able to see this piece of work behind me. That's the original piece that was reproduced on the book. And yes, Ted packed up that 250-pound slab of wood and mailed it off to us, and we have it displayed in our dining room. And it's just a beautiful piece of work. And I hope when you get the book, you'll be able to see that. Um, well, that was a bonus prequel for those of you who managed to tune in on time. I think we've got a quorum here, and I think we can begin. So um, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Um, and say again, thank you, all of you who made made time and space to join us this evening. It's always challenging to sit in front of a screen at the end of a 3-day holiday. This is our first webinar in a while, and I just want to give 3 reasons for offering this webinar. at this time. The first is to offer a bit of President's Day detox. All of you have successfully screened out the fantasia of the Trump regime for a day at least. You may now re-engage your device for the next 90 minutes to be rehumanized through good conversation of resistance and renewal. This is a shot of some friends and colleagues back in Connecticut today, representing on this day. The second reason is, as some of you in Southern California know, those of you who are cringing just a little bit as Ted was talking about fire in sycamores, given what we've been through here in the last 6 weeks. But because of the fires in Los Angeles, we had to postpone our official book launch for this book in Pasadena, which we scheduled for Saturday, a couple of days ago. We have rescheduled it for April 5th, but this is a little makeup program to keep the embers of redemption and refreshment going. So that's the second reason. The third reason is this is the first President's Day weekend in almost 20 years that we at Bartimaeus Cooperative Ministries are not hosting a Bartimaeus Kinsler Institute here in our bioregion. And it feels a little strange for Elaine and Chris and I to be not crazy running around this weekend. So we thought we ought to do something to mark the time. Many of you know that this institute will continue its life in May at Kirkridge Retreat Center, and you'll find information on that both on the Kirkridge website and on the BCM website. So those are three pretty good reasons to have a little bit of programming. We can't talk about the Bartimaeus Kinsler Institute without also talking about the experiment on whose shoulders we stand, namely the Word and World People's School, which was a national collaborative which met around in different cities around the country, learning movement history. And the motto for both Word and World and for our Bartimaeus Kinsler Institute was working at the intersection between seminary, sanctuary, streets, and soil. So for those of you familiar with these spaces, it's a good time to remember and reflect and be grateful. For those of you new to it, we invite you to check out Word and World People's School online, our Bartimaeus Kinsler Institute on our bcmonline.org. But there's another reason for naming these amazing collaborations at the outset tonight. In the past 8 days, we've lost 2 dear elders who were animators of these spaces with us. I'm talking about Blessed Gloria Kinsler and Blessed Nelson Johnson. Nelson passed 8 days ago in Greensboro with his family, surrounded by his family at the age of 81. Nelson was and remains the animator of the beloved community center. He is a survivor of the Greensboro Massacre of 1979. He is the animator of the First Truth and Community Reconciliation Project on U.S. soil in Greensboro from 2004 to 2006, and a statewide TRC that they are working on now in North Carolina. He has been he's a pastor and a warrior for justice over well more than 60 years. And most importantly to our hearts, he is our friend and our mentor. And it's really hard to see him go. Elaine and I will be hopping on a plane and flying into the ice storm in Greensboro in order to be at his funeral on Friday of this coming week. In the middle picture, you see Nelson at our very first Word and World School teaching us about the great sit-in movement of Greensboro that happened on my birthday when I was 5 years old. Yes, turning 70, you get a little retrospective. On the left is Gloria Kinsler. She and her beloved husband Ross were also great colleagues and mentors of ours. They spent much of their life as missionaries in Central America, deeply involved in sanctuary movement building and popular education and liberation theology. And Ross passed in 2000, right at the beginning of COVID, and Gloria just crossed the River Jordan on Valentine's Day here in Southern California. In 2015, we renamed our institute the Bartimaeus Kinsler Institute in their honor. So as we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, these two beloved elders are not viewing the webinar. They've got way too much to catch up on wherever they are, but we invoke their presence by saying Gloria Kinsler and Nelson Johnson, presente. Oh, and there's one more reason we're beaming out tonight, and that is to formally welcome publicly for the first time this new book. As most of you know, it looks at Luke's Jesus as interrogator of the rich and advocate for Sabbath economics. HARP, as we fondly refer to it here in-house, is available through bookshop.org online. I think you all know that bookshop.org is an independent bookstore consolidator. So to avoid the broligarchy, we're trying to point people there, or at your local independent bookstore. It is, we're having supply issues in moving books around the country. So I know a number of you have seen that it's listed on back order and so on, but please persist for the rest of this month. With this discount code you see here, you can get HARP for under 40 bucks. And if you try and just get nowhere, email Chris. He'll hook you up at a really good price. Sorry for the delays in supplying this book. We're trying to get it out, and who knows, maybe others are trying for it not to get out. So one final thought before we turn to Brother Chuck Collins. As those of you who were in church yesterday, the gospel text for the sixth Sunday in Epiphany was Luke's Sermon on the Plain, which in a very interesting way takes Matthew's much more famous Sermon on the Mount down to level ground, literally. You may recall that Luke's parallel chant of blessings upon the poor and woe upon the rich that you see here. This is the opening of the Sermon on the Plain. This really functions to raise up the poor and bring down the rich, just as Mary's Magnificat promised at the beginning of Luke's story of Jesus. So this is the vision of Sabbath economics that I've tried to explore in this new book. It's a reading of Luke that is particularly geared to the Year C lectionary for those in churches that use the lectionary. Tried really hard to get it out to be a resource in this year, and what an appropriate year to be focusing those things. And so I encourage you to look at our blog on our bcmonline.org site. I'm blogging every week trying to keep up with the Lucan readings in the lectionary and give some excerpts from the book and talk about how that lands today. Um, but tonight, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the book, but rather exploring what um, it means in the world today. And to partner with me is Chuck Collins. Chris, if you want to highlight Chuck, please. Um, this guy right here is, uh, well, he's long been um, one of my favorite um, articulators of the reality, the disturbing and dismaying realities in which we find ourselves economically. Chuck and I met sometime in the early 2000s. You may remember better than I, Chuck, when exactly that was, but it was around a Sabbath Economics retreat in New England where Chuck is inhabiting. And we agreed then, and I think fair to say we agree even more so today about the looming political crisis of plutocracy and the social crisis of economic disparity. Um, so both of these have now infected the body politic to an unprecedented degree, obviously. Um, Over the last quarter century, so since we first met in New England, Chuck has devoted his work to education, advocacy, and organizing around these issues through United for a Fair Economy and currently inequality.org. His multiple platforms are the best sources for reliable analysis in this country at this time, in my opinion, and I commend them to you. You'll have a chance to hear about them tonight. Um, During the same period, I've concentrated on trying to change the story in the culture, both economically and theologically, because the rise of both plutocracy and disparity are deeply rooted in public narratives. Um, Trump won because he relentlessly spins a story about poor people as a threat, about rich people as saviors, and about running the government like an autocratic corporate boardroom as the solution. Um, so, healing affluenza, resisting plutocracy is another of my attempts to move the sacred narrative of Sabbath economics from the margins to the center of churchly faith and practice. Um, but Chuck's work is where this work meets the road of how we bring about meaningful structural change. So, um, talking about stories, Chuck, let's start with yours. Would you set a little bit of life context for listeners who don't know your journey? Um, because your journey is an inspiring example of a discipleship of healing from affluenza and resisting plutocracy. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and thank you, Chuck, on this cold, wintry night in New England for joining us.
Thanks, Ched. Thanks, brother Ched. And I had the opportunity to read Ched's book in an earlier form and work on the foreword with him, and I really recommend it. I think it's, how do you say, it's incredibly prophetic and timely to this moment that we're in. And it's great to see some of you, some familiar faces joining this evening. So thank you for coming, including my couple of my cousins are here, which is really awesome.
All right.
Um, so but I guess I would say I was born on third base. I won the lottery at birth. I grew up in a wealthy family in the suburbs of Detroit, but I was very much shaped by. In 1967, there were the Detroit so-called riots, the uprising in Detroit, and I was fortunate to have a mother who had both my parents, but my mother in particular was very, very focused on sort of fairness, and her sensibilities sort of helped me understand some of what was happening. And I was very much formed by the late '70s social movements and spent time in Central America. But yeah, I was told about the age 16 that I was going to inherit a substantial amount of wealth. So I sort of wrestled with that through my late teens and early 20s. And fortunately, I had some terrific elders living in Western Massachusetts, Wally and Juanita Nelson, who were war tax resistors, and Chuck Mathai and the Institute for Community Economics, where I worked for 10 years. Some of you I met through that, sort of doing community land trusts and affordable housing work. So I was and a number of women religious who I actually lived in community with. So I sort of lived in a Catholic worker community, and that kind of gave me another window or another ideal, if you will. We lived very, very simply, so sort of trying to experience living with less and not over consuming. And just understanding, as Juanita Nelson used to talk about, or sort of the John Woolman concept of where are the seeds of war in our lifestyle and how we lived. So I was very lucky in terms of in the elder department, and so yeah, at the age of 26, I made a decision to kind of pass on the inheritance that I was received and had control over at that point, and still maintained a strong connection with my parents, and kind of tried to explain that I was doing it out of gratitude. And in a sense, it was liberating. It was opened me up to another past set of passages and experiences in my life. So that was a bit of formation, and that was a while ago. Let's say it was about 40 years ago. But I have no regrets about that, and in fact, I feel like it sort of made the path that I've taken possible. It also meant I could kind of look unflinchingly and undefensively at the sort of systemic inequalities. I wasn't sort of racked by the sense of like, oh, I'm the problem here or whatever. I'm a beneficiary. I am a beneficiary. I have enormous advantages and privileges, even without the wealth. There's sort of like a mountain of other advantages. So I've tried to just sort of live a life exploring how those advantages have worked. And I was fortunate to meet Ched and the Sabbath Day Economics and the Word and World crew early on. So that was also a really great formation and discipleship experience. So anyway, I'm grateful that I get to be with you all. Um,
Thank you, Chuck. And I want to recognize that there are a few veteran Catholic workers on this call. I see you, Steve Baggerly, from Norfolk. I also want to recognize our friend Jeff Broughton is beaming in from Australia, faithful brother that he is. Longtime friend Brad Brockman, lots of old friends on this call. Thank you for being with us. Um, For some folks, plutocracy is not a word or an idea they're familiar with. So let's start the analysis there. Chuck, how might you define it, and why is it a useful analytical term for you?
yeah, I think we're hearing words like plutocracy and more frequently oligarchy right now.
Mhm.
Plutocracy kind of ruled by wealth, oligarchy ruled by a few. Although, as I understand the original Socrates, oligarchy was also ruled by a wealthy few.
Mhm.
And that is a description of a system that has existed through history. It was interesting that uh, President Biden, in his sort of farewell address, said we are becoming an oligarchy. But prior to that, Jimmy Carter, in an interview, talked about sort of legalized bribery and a system of oligarchy. So I think it is a useful term in terms of describing the overall system that we're living in. And there are obviously historic oligarchies, and there are other oligarchies, and we hear plutocracy and oligarchy used to describe Russia or other societies that currently exist. Um, but and one thing that is often confusing is it's often juxtaposed with democracy or societies that have a vote. But as Jeffrey Winters, who kind of wrote the book on oligarchy and plutocracy, would say, you can have a voting system in an oligarchy, in a plutocracy. It doesn't get you very far, but you can maintain sort of the trappings of democracy while wealth concentrates and power concentrates. And I think that is the dynamic we're living with, is sort of this compounding advantage, where wealthy people use their power to rig the rules to get more wealth and power. And it becomes, it's sort of like a doom loop, if you will, like a sort of, it just kind of gets more and more. And that's kind of what I think has brought us to this moment.
So let's just take a minute and try to form a little bit of historical context, Chuck, if we could. Because obviously the rule of the rich is nothing new in Western history and beyond. Um, and that includes the ancient Roman world in which Jesus taught and acted in Palestine in the first century. But it has particular history in the US where oligarchic plutocracy keeps undermining the nation as an experiment in political and economic democracy. Um, what I've learned is that there were notable episodes or chapters in how this has worked in our history, notably the slave owning class resisting challenges to uh, their economic system in the 1850s and really kind of setting the stage for the Civil War. Um, Again, after the white supremacist backlash on Reconstruction, and again, in the Gilded Age of the 1890s, kind of the rise of the corporate oligarchy. Um, Again, in the rise of corporate power and influence in the 1940s, Reverend Barber talks a lot about how corporations played a huge role um, courting theologians and church leaders to get them to uh, adopt the gospel to their corporate view of goodness. Um, and and so now we've got our current moment of the broligarchy. What thoughts do you have in your work as you reflect on some of the historical precedents and what we learn from those, Chuck?
Yeah, I think it is useful to understand that there have been plutocracies, oligarchies through history. I think to realize that we have been kind of in a similar chapter of great concentrations of wealth and power. People talk about the first Gilded Age, roughly 1880 to 1915 or so, as sort of a coming out of the rise of industrialization, coming out of Civil War, Reconstruction, this huge updraft of wealth into the hands of a few, the great trusts that captured, the oil industry like Rockefeller and the like. So I think, looking at those previous chapters of plutocracy and oligarchy in the US and understand what people did in response to them, to reverse those conditions or break them apart. Um, there's a historian I recommend named Peter Turchin, who wrote a recent book called End Times. He looks at the sort of instability that comes from a plutocratic economy where wealth gets more and more wealth is funneled up. There's a kind of wage stagnation and a miseration of everybody else. So great inequality, growing insecurity, what the English calls the precariat, the rising precariousness of people, um, and that leads to an imbalance of wealth and power. And he has a phrase called elite overproduction, where the rich are competing with each other for seats of power. It's like musical chairs, except instead of taking the chairs away, you add people to the game. more and more rich people. So you start to see what we see today, competition within the elites, the liberal elites and the conservative and the right wing and the libertarian elites are all competing with each other for power. And the rest of us are kind of like spectators watching these billionaire gladiators duke it out. So I think the parallel to a century ago to the first Gilded Age is really relevant to understand today. One thing about that period is it was met with alarm. You know, the populist pushback that led to the first income taxes and inheritance taxes and antitrust legislation, which wasn't terribly effective, but it was still coming out of World War One. There was a push to address these concentrations of wealth, and there was a sense that we were jeopardizing this sort of fragile, self-governing republic, such as it was. And you had Louis Brandeis, a Supreme Court justice later in his life, but he said, you know, you can have concentrated wealth in the hands of a few, or you can have democracy, but you can't have both.
Mm.
And that I think is, and what's troubling, I think, about the present moment is we've sort of lost that historic understanding. Like this is really fundamentally jeopardizing what we hold dear. That these extreme inequalities of wealth and power, and there's sort of like some kind of next level to this moment. So here we are going into this plutocratic second Gilded Age, but and I'm sure the media ownership was concentrated in the first Gilded Age, but the things like artificial intelligence, social media, there's sort of almost a, a higher level of capture, not just political capture, but sort of capture of our consciousness, capture of the narrative. And this is why, again, I think Ched's book is so important because part of resisting plutocracy is to understand or resist the narrative that justifies it. So I think we are in this weird perfect storm of concentrated wealth and power, media ownership, consciousness, you know, narrative propagation, you know, and I'm sure you, like me, if you all have talked to friends and family who, you know, voted for President Trump, who their media diet is entirely different than what you may be reading, consuming, listening to. And so you have this sort of parallel reality thing. So that's I think one of the challenges of our plutocratic moment.
Mm-hmm. So given that, and you know, as usual, you give such good, concise uh, articulations of the dilemma. Um, this convergence of wealth and power and domination over the media, media of all kinds, old media and new media. Actually, I want to interrupt myself to ask you. I'm throwing you a little bit of a curve, but I don't know, Chuck, if you've seen the documentary "Stripped for Parts," but it documents the process over the last 10 years of um, how hedge funds have been buying up local newspapers and killing them in order to take over their property, which oftentimes in the old school media was downtown and very proximate to value. They kill the paper, they sell the property owned by the paper, and they make money. And this has been spreading for well more than a decade, but because so many of the papers, the journalists were employed by so many of these papers that had been taken over, they did not feel free to really tell that story. This all comes out in this recent documentary. So it's both new media, but it's also old media that these concentrations of wealth and power are happening. So given all of this, what you know, you are on the lead of pushing back, And in your experience, what are the Achilles heels of plutocratic intentions today? And how should that be influencing how we organize?
Well, I think part of living in a plutocracy is it's not a good place to live for most people. The quality of life really does deteriorate. Um, and I think there is some value to talking about the power of billionaires right now. That sort of has people's attention, and it crosses political divides when you start to talk about billionaire wealth and power. Now, there's still some celebration of certain billionaires because we think they've done something useful for society, and there are cases of that. But I think what most people, this idea that, and actually I think you use the word Achilles heel, but I think during the pandemic, when and one of the things we did was we tracked the growth of billionaire wealth over the pandemic. So
Yeah.
2020, we started to track, there were 700 billionaires, and together they had $2.5 trillion. And by the end of the pandemic, there were 800 billionaires, and they had $6 trillion. And today, now the billionaires have $7 trillion. So that does strike a nerve, even when people don't fully understand what a billion is. It's still like a huge amount of wealth and power. And I think the Achilles heel is sort of explaining how that connecting the dots, how that concentration of wealth matters to you, how it's undermining your quality of life, why you should take it very, very personally. So housing, if you can't find affordable housing, your children can't find affordable housing, it's very easy to sort of connect the dots to like how billionaire disruption of the housing market's driving up the cost of land and housing, or we're building all this housing that's not even for people to live in, but just sort of like wealth storage units. Private equity firms are moving into single family rental housing. They're buying up apartment buildings to convert to short-term rentals. You can sort of tell the story of housing through the lens of billionaire concentration of wealth and power. So we could talk more about that, but I would say pretty much everything you care about, your health, the environment, democracy, your voice and your vote. You care about your pets. Well, the billionaire-backed private equity funds are buying up all the veterinary practices. They're buying up communications in prisons. So think of it as like sort of encroaching into your life. Your example around media is a great example, like stripping for parts. Well, that's our healthcare system,
Mhm.
Private equity buys the hospital, it takes the real estate, it slices and dices, it extracts fees everywhere along the way. So that is one of the vulnerabilities, I think, the Achilles heel. The other is the people who voted for the current president in the hope that they were going to kind of do something that was going to help them deal with the economic pain that they're in. Well, the plutocrats, the oligarchs, they're not going to address the fundamental underlying causes of the pain. They're going to be all kinds of distractions and all kinds of symbolic things. But in the end, people are not going to feel better in 2 years or 4 years or 6 years. The fundamental inequalities are not going to be addressed, and they're going to feel that. And I think that is, from an organizing point of view, those are the points. There are some rifts, if you will, that are already there. What does big pharma think about Robert Kennedy? Like that's a rift. So part of it is to look at those places where the current oligarch agenda, if you will, really isn't going to be good for anybody,
Mm.
and kind of helping change that story a little bit. So I think those are, looking for the pressure points in this moment, figuring out where are the things that people really care about, and sort of saying, well, actually, that's really being undermined by this plutocratic power grab.
Yeah.
Um,
That's really helpful, and I want to continue in that vein. I really appreciate, John, your naming Gerardo Marti's notion of disinfotainment. That's what's being shoveled at working class folks who voted for Trump, as well as at the rest of us. And um, how long our attention span will be captured by that is in in many ways up to us to tell more compelling stories in all sorts of ways. And that's really what you have been doing now for more than a quarter century, Tuck. I mean, you're not just popping into this fight. You have been on it, and in lots of different ways. So you've experimented with different campaigns, different approaches. I really want folks to learn a little bit of the genealogy of your work over the last quarter century. If you can give a little history of what you've done, because um, uh, it's so instructive, I think, for all of us who are organizer educators to see how you've tried to navigate this to then be able to bring your full weight in this present moment. So, can you dial back to say 25 years ago or so, and talk talk a little bit about how just what are some of the main threads of evolution that you'd like people to know?
what a nice question to be asked uh, after your 65th birthday or whatever. Um, the as I alluded to, I'd spent my 20s as kind of a tenant organizer. I worked with tenants in mobile home parks that were trying to buy their mobile home parks and own them as cooperatives. I worked in affordable housing, but I could start to see these growing inequalities, the systemic growth of systemic inequality, late 70s, 80s into I remember reading The Politics of Rich and Poor by Kevin Phillips and thinking, wow, yeah, I really see these inequalities in the lives of the people I'm working with. Um, but I did in 95 started this organization called United for a Fair Economy. We actually had the initial name Share the Wealth. Everybody said, well, that's a little too radical. So United for a Fair Economy. And given that I had grown up, given that I was born on third base and I grew up with a fair amount of wealth and class privilege, um, I was intrigued by this idea of can we organize, can we find, I kept meeting other wealthy people who supported, movements toward a more equitable society. And so we, there was a movement funded by mostly very wealthy oligarchs the, to abolish the estate tax,
Hmm.
the U.S. inheritance tax that only is paid by multimillionaires and billionaires. That they called it the death tax. They hired, the Mars family, the Mars Candy family, the Waltons, the Gallo wine family, all these kind of wealthy families put together and funded a campaign to get rid of the estate tax. And they were doing a great job. I mean, they had pretty much convinced everybody that the estate tax was the death of the family farm and small businesses, and they kept everybody focused on, you know, um, working class folks who might someday pay an estate tax as opposed to who is really going to benefit. And so I tried to organize a movement of business leaders and wealthy people to oppose abolishing the estate tax. And I got a call from Bill Gates's father, Bill Gates Sr., who just passed to the other side maybe 4 years ago. But he's like, I think the estate tax is an all-American tax. It slows this concentration of wealth and power. It, it's a good thing. And I want to help. How can I help? And he generously stepped up and we organized a campaign of multimillionaires and billionaires to oppose abolishing the estate tax. And I learned a lot from that. One was that there was a theatrical side to that. There was something about, celebrity, wealthy people It was different. It was a man bites dog story. So the media is always like, what? Wealthy people who say they should pay more taxes? That's interesting. And it disrupted the narrative of deservedness that so much held inequality in place. So, people say, well, why should we shouldn't tax the rich? They're the wealth creators. They're the entrepreneurs. They're the generators of all that's good. And then you had these wealthy people saying, well, actually, I benefit from these public investments in our society, and I didn't do it alone, and I live in a community, and public investments are the foundation for my business creation and wealth. So they offered a completely, entirely different narrative. So I mentioned that story because I think it has informed the work around inequality that we need to organize movements of working people who have been harmed by the economy, but there are potential allies within the wealthy classes that should be organized as well. Um, and then I think, the early years of United for a Fair Economy, we focused a lot on income, wages, because wages in the 70s, 80s were flat and even falling for the bottom half of society. So raise the minimum wage, campaigns for living wages, those were very much a part of our work in the 90s and the aughts. Um, but the minimum wage at the federal level hasn't been updated since 2009. So I wish I could say we were making more progress there. But one of the things that affected us was seeing, you may recall the Occupy movement, the 1%. That was a very powerful movement because it named that inequality. It talked about the wealth of the 1%. But what we were seeing was wealth and income funneling not just to the 1%, but in the last 15 years, more and more to the top 1/10 of 1%. So pushing for taxing wealth was a key part of the campaigns that we were part of, but we did not have a huge amount of success. And part of it was what I learned, again, partly through having a front row seat to how wealth and privilege works, was this whole sector of, I call it the wealth defense industry. These are the hired enablers that the ultra wealthy, and now we're talking about people with wealth, over 30, 40 million or more. When you hit that level of wealth, you have a whole staff, if you will, that will help you minimize tax, maximize investment returns, and maximize dynastic succession, meaning they're trying to help you pass as much wealth untaxed to the next generation. So all of a sudden, what I was learning was huge amounts of wealth was moving to the shadows. And even the levels of inequality we talk about today, I think underestimate just how unequal our societies have become because so much wealth is now in anonymous trusts and shell corporations and offshore and the like. So that then became a part of my work was to kind of expose that system. So anyway, those are a few touch points of I guess Ched's word genealogy, but that kind of understanding the other thing I'll just mention is trying to keep our spirits up and keep our sense of humor. We organized something in 2001 called Billionaires for Bush that was like a theatrical group, but it just caught fire. And there were over 120 Billionaires for Bush chapters that formed kind of as a sort of over the top street theater, humorous way to draw attention to the inequalities. And we'll talk about this later, but we're reviving Trillionaires for Trump in the immediate term. I'll tell you more about that, but there'll be some opportunities to form your own chapter of Trillionaires for Trump.
That's awesome.
And part of it is, actually, I went to a demonstration today in my town too. 300 of us came out, President's Day. But it was, kind of like your usual vigil slash demonstration. And I was kind of wishing, you know what? We need the trillionaires for Trump here to kind of liven things up. So anyway, we'll talk about that. But, I think the trying to help connect the dots between what it is that you care about and these structural inequalities continues to be kind of a challenge for all of us in this work, I think.
Thanks, Chuck. I really want folks to understand, if they're not already familiar with Chuck's work, which has been both writing, organizing, advocating, policy analysis, and creating a little good trouble. It's so exemplary, and we all have so much to learn, and we should not be without tools to meet this moment. And that's what Chuck has really spent his life um, shaping. Want to get to your book that you just finished and sent to the publisher, but before I do that, um, most of our listeners are um, from a faith-rooted context, as are you. And I'm wondering if you might just say a little word just to further fill out your biography about how your Catholic tradition has informed and continues to inform this work that you're talking about, the work we call Sabbath Economics.
Well, I was so fortunate to be connecting to Ched and the Sabbath Economics crew, but it was interesting. The year I was just thinking about this today, the year that I gave away the wealth that I had inherited was 1986, and that was the year that the U.S. bishops wrote this pastoral letter,
Mm.
economic justice for all. I don't know where some of you were, but that was really, really formative for me. And I was part of a whole like diocesan education committee where I lived in Western Mass, and we did all kinds of discussions and programs. And there was this phrase in the pastoral letter, which is society has a social mortgage on wealth. Um, that there's this idea that individual wealth ownership is absolute and it's all mine. And this idea that society actually has not a claim on it because no individual created it. It is a form of societal or, spiritual wealth. And I think that I just remember thinking, wow, that is truly a radical concept. And it does feed into that narrative of, is it all mine? Or so I think that was formative, spending time in Central America, being exposed to, the radical gospel in that emergent context, the preferential option for the poor. It seems like today we're seeing the preferential option for the billionaires
Mm.
as kind of like a tag for the moment we're living in. Um, but yeah, and just understanding the power of wealth idolatry and what does it mean to try to resist that. And that's where I think the healing affluenza piece comes in. That you know, wealth is like a disconnection drug. It disconnects us from one another. It means we don't have to ask one another for help. This is my speaking as somebody who grew up in that I had to learn how to be interdependent because because wealth creates the illusion that you don't have to
Mm.
ask your neighbor for help. I don't have to ask Mike Little to help me fix my car. I can hire somebody to do that, you
Mm.
know? So I'm not in a relationship of reciprocity with Mike. So Mike isn't going to ask me to help him, and I'm not going to ask, and we're going to stay disconnected and isolated and vulnerable. So I think um, sort of understanding that power of interconnection and the antidote to wealth disconnection is connection and learning how to practice reciprocity and vulnerability in a community setting. So learning mutual aid, learning interdependence. And I sort of feel today still like, whew, I'm still learning that. I'm still add a masculine overlay to that, and along with the class privilege and the the wealthy, my wealthy peers are isolated.
Hmm.
They're waiting to be invited home to something bigger and more meaningful.
Hmm.
And that's the invitation. So when we think of these oligarchs and wealthy people, we can think of them as the enemy, but you can also think of them as your long lost relatives who need to be invited home and welcome to the table, not at the head of the table,
Hmm.
but at the table,
Hmm.
and that they too have gifts to contribute, not their money, but some other, So I think that is fully informed by the teachings of Jesus for me.
Thank you. Well, friends, in a few minutes, you're going to have an opportunity to ask Chuck some questions. So be thinking about those, and we'll figure out a good way to moderate those. You can chat them in, but it's nicer if you show your face and unmute and ask your questions. So use the hand raise function. You all know how to do that in Zoom. If you don't, go ahead and chat it in. I'm going to ask just a couple more questions, and then we'll open this up. So Chuck, tell us about the new book. Actually, tell folks a little bit about your many publications leading up to the new book, because I want people to, you've not only uh, advocated and provided analysis and popular education, but you've also published a bunch of stuff, and you've just published a new book called Burned by Billionaires. So tell us a little bit about your publishing career, brother.
No. Yeah, I've co-written a couple of books with on economic inequality issues. In 2016, I wrote more. It's not really a memoir, but it's sort of a reflection on privilege called "Born on Third Base." A one percenter makes the case for tackling inequality, bringing wealth home, and committing to the common good. So that's kind of more stories, more personal narrative, how I came to understand things. Uh, Ched had a slide. There's a book I wrote called The Wealth Hoarders, How Billionaires Paid Millions to Hide Trillions. That's sort of about this whole world of hidden wealth and the industry and the enablers. And in the process of writing that, I keep meeting these wealth managers who are kind of like at the end of their lives and who are wanting to do good. And so enlisting them to sort of address the hidden wealth problems. A couple of years ago, I wrote a novel called Altar to an Erupting Sun, which I is kind of a different flavor, but was really interesting for me to have that experience. And it's about someone who believes we are in a Bonhoeffer moment in the fight to save the Earth. And so it's a work of fiction. It's edgy, but it also kind of talks about formation, and there's elements of it that some of you, I bet, could relate to in terms of some of the movements of the last couple decades and how those have shaped us. And the new book is, I wish it was coming out today. I wish it was coming out simultaneously with Ched's book, but it won't be out to the fall. It's called Burned by Billionaires, How Concentrated Wealth and Power Are Ruining Our Lives and Our Planet. And it is kind of along the lines of what I was talking about earlier. It's about how the concentrated wealth is touching your life very, very personally. We haven't really talked about environmental, but the wealthy are the super polluters, the super emitters. The richest 1% are responsible for half of all the carbon emissions in the world. I mean, it's just huge. So that matters. obviously democracy matters, how our political system's captured. So it's really trying to kind of connect those dots very, very personally, how the quality of our lives are touched.
So you can find all of Chuck's publications on his various websites, including inequality.org. Um, uh, what is one thing, Chuck, that you are doing to maintain your equilibrium in this fraught moment? You're feeling it as much or more than all of us. And one of the places you turn to is political cartooning, including public political cartooning, as a powerful way of speaking the truth, but having some fun with it too. But what's another thing? This might be the place to talk about trillionaires for Trump. Love the love the wordplay. But what else are you doing to maintain equilibrium right now for yourself, both personally and politically?
Yeah, I mean, this could be the whole topic of a go around. I'm curious to hear you, Chad, address this as well, because I think it is a highly disorienting moment. I mean, you've heard that expression flooding the zone, but there's so much coming at us right now. There's so much troubling news. There's so much things and it's very deliberate. It's part of the sort of Trump governing by chaos, attack on, so I think taking care of ourselves and our bodies and our spirits in this moment is absolutely critical. I mean, literally, physically, making sure we're paying attention to our bodies and eating well and being kind of prepared. I think looking at the profiles in courage that are happening, where the people are stepping forward. One of my one of my friends writes a column in our local paper. She's just turned it over to writing about people. She, you know, the prosecutor who resigned when Trump told her to stop prosecuting the mayor of New York. People like that who are kind of risking their own, not just going along, but are actively resisting. We should be celebrating and noticing these folks. Um, and then I think finding something that you can focus on in this fire hose of stuff coming at us, picking some things. And local community matters in times like this. If you're not part of a face-to-face regular coffee clatch or group of friends that get together and just kind of process and pray and think about this moment, find that, find one other person and then invite a third, like form those. So my wife Mary and I have a men's coffee clatch that meets every Monday. We met this morning, and now we have a community gathering every Friday in our community center, and that's just like open space. So I think those, in addition to sort of showing up for demonstrations, showing up for places where we can make a difference. So I think that's, um, I feel like because I know I'm interested in oligarchy, I'm doing a lot of work on that. And actually, I did a briefing for Senator Sanders. Just he and one other person and I sort of prepared him. He's now going on a speaking tour. He's calling it the anti-oligarchy speaking tour. He's going to be going out to red states, so supporting leaders like Senator Sanders who understand and can very effectively speak to working class voters about the moment we're in, I think, and equipping people like that. Yeah, no, I think Trillionaires for Trump, in another week, I'll be able to send you a link to some resources. That is actually about keeping our spirits up and our humor up. And what I noticed when we had this Billionaires for Bush, these theater groups, was people came out of the woodwork. People who were kind of like so discouraged that they didn't want to do anything came out of the woodwork and applied their spark and creativity to that. Think of all the slogans you can come up with. Mine is You know, a billion doesn't go as far as it used to. Trillionaires for Trump. We we want to become trillionaires in the next 4 years. We only have 4 years to become a trillionaire. So we've got to cut taxes for the rich and cut spending and keep funneling more money up to the top and sort of play with it, be playful about it, because that is the moment we're in. So those are some of the things. And I bounce that to you too, Chad. Give us some of your pastoral thought or two on that moment.
Well, I want to retain the focus on your good work, but this is a topic that we're always addressing in our circles and need to, and your wisdom is really much appreciated. Now, friends, I think you can see why, as I was writing this book, I was clear from the very beginning that there was no person who I would rather have as a riding shotgun on this project to ground it, to anchor it in the current social political struggle for hearts and minds. And when Chuck responded that he'd be delighted to write the foreword, I just felt like I'd won the lottery. I'm so appreciative, Chuck, of your work and your partnership, and um, let's make this a year where these kinds of efforts to pull back the veil can find broad audiences in all the different ways in which people are reached. Along those lines, we're going to open it up for question. But Chuck, let's just take a moment now. If you can tell folks how they can support your amazing work at inequality.org, how would you direct folks to support you all?
Yeah, I would say check out inequality.org. We do a weekly newsletter. It comes from me, and talk about the horror, hope, and humor of this moment. And we try to lift up encouraging examples. So check out inequality.org. We're a project of the Institute for Policy Studies, so that's where I work. If you're interested in more on the writing side, chuckcollinswrites.com or .org. You can find kind of commentaries, writing articles, reports. But yeah, inequality.org, I think, is kind of your one stop for action and engagement. And yeah, if you want to support the work, you can donate there. You could be a monthly pledger, $2 a month or whatever. Those kind of things really actually matter to small organizations. And yeah, you'll see a couple of projects there that are very much about looking at issues of billionaires and billionaire wealth and power, um, how it's affecting philanthropy in the nonprofit sector. So some of you work for nonprofit charitable organizations. You may know there's huge amounts of wealth that are kind of being warehoused now in foundations and donor advised funds. So we're actually working on the policy side to sort of move some of that money off the sidelines and support the real work in the nonprofit sector. So those are some of the projects we're involved with. I'm very involved in a project to stop private jet expansion at airports. So one of the problems with a plutocracy is plutocrats don't want to sit next to you or me on the plane. They want to have their own. They don't want to be the chance that they're going to have to sit next to Ched Myers and he's going to start engaging them on some on their soul, So they every billionaire's got to have a private jet or at least two. So there's a huge demand for private jets, and this may break your heart, Ched, to know this. There are a lot of unhoused private jets. They don't have enough hangars. So all these airports now are building hangar space for private jets. And so just like we shouldn't be building new fossil fuel infrastructure, pipelines and coal plants, we shouldn't be building new infrastructure for private jets, the most polluting form of travel, the most optional, by the way, form of travel as well. So those are important campaigns to find, and like anything in the moment, it's like, where do we have agency and where do we have room to move? And let's find those places. And so maybe at the national level, the door seems a little shut right now to some kinds of change, but at local and regional levels, we can engage in fights around airport expansion, that kind of thing.
So Chuck and his network friends can not only help us map what's happening, but also can help point to ways in which all of us can be involved. I want to turn the mic over to you all. Meantime, Chris has been keeping track in the chat with some of these websites. Maybe put in inequality.org again, Chris. I really want to urge you to support this brother and the great work he's been doing for more than 30 years and continues to do as we speak. He needs our support. We need his work. And he is really partnering with our little theological venture to help change the narrative. So please raise your hand and ask a question. I want to recognize my nephew, Thomas Drieger-Enns, and his partner, Michelle, who are beaming in from Saskatchewan. Really delighted you all came online. And if you are still with us and you want to, I'll give you the first crack. If you have a question, then unmute and ask it. Otherwise, if I don't hear from you, we'll go with hands. So floor is open to ask Chuck Collins a question or to encourage him in his work. Thomas, Michelle, you there? Yes, still? Maybe. Oh, there you are. Hey, man.
Hey, thanks for the opportunity. Michelle had to take Forrest to bed, so it's just me at this point. So as far as thank you so much for the wisdom and Chuck for your words. I think a question that I would have at this point is as a Canadian, a lot of the geopolitical strife it transcends international borders. Do you have any wisdom that would be salient for Canadians at this time?
So that's Elaine's beloved nephew there, who's a social justice lawyer in Saskatchewan. Great to see your face. Chuck, what do you got?
First, my apologies. The embarrassment of our administration and the comments about Canada. But, actually just had a talk with good friends from Ireland yesterday too. I think the key here is do not encourage your countries to resist Trumpism. You use every tool that you've got. Watch out for globally funded movements. The Tony Blair Institute, which is funded by U.S. billionaires like Larry Ellison and Elon Musk, is working in 120 countries to export sort of the sort of neoliberal, extreme neoliberal, extractive capitalist model everywhere they go. So be wary of all those efforts to try to move toward this sort of Trump U.S. model, and just remind other Canadians that there's a lot of us who are, believe, respect Canadian sovereignty and want to learn from the Canadian work around healthcare and other, social wealth understanding, So don't be like us. Do what whatever. That's it. And that, I think Trump and his, the Vance and company are doing a lot to unify Europe right now, in extraordinary ways. I think the European Union will be sticking together in ways that they probably never anticipated they will to resist some of what's coming at them.
Thanks. Brad Brockman, brother Brad, been a long time. Nice to see your face. What would you like to ask Chuck?
I actually want to ask you a question. I can wait to the end. He let you off the hook, and I don't want to let you off the hook about how do we, and by the way, I'm about 40 minutes from his Grange he's up in Guilford, I'm down in Hadley, so Chuck, I'll be in touch separately. But anyway, and we may have met at an early World and Moral in early 2000s. But anyway, um, yeah, part of the challenge that we face, each of us, is, the information overload, the disinformation overload, but actually the information itself is so um, problematic. And the the more you allow yourself to get into it, the more disabling it can become. As someone who's been doing work in prisons for 25 years and wrote 2 books on emerging best practices for LGBTQI in youth in prisons and adults, and knowing what happened the last time around with our transgender, transsexual brothers and sisters, and what it means to have drugs removed or stopped. Um, Fear is their weapon of choice and the thing that keeps us disempowered. And how do we balance, how do you balance information taken and, you know, anyway, it's a tough question, and I'm interested in finding that place. For me, I'm stopping often at headlines because I know if I get in, my own OCD, ADD, dive deep into rabbit holes becomes even more disempowering. So turning back to prayer practices or and other things help, but how is that balance? And maybe Chuck, you can talk about it as well. How do you balance that, the need to sort of stay on top of what's there and the need to remain in a place of agency, in a place where my heart is actually functioning, not completely compromised?
Thanks, Brad. Chuck?
What a great comment, Brad. Good to look forward to connecting with you down the road. Yeah, I'm definitely limiting how much I can take in right now. At the same time, I'm trying to figure out where can I exercise solidarity, where, I think the direct attacks on, I mean, I live in an area where the World Learning Center, School for International Training. There's a lot of people who are internationalists. Either they've come from other countries or they care about the rest of the world. And foreign aid has always been sort of a bugaboo and an object of attack. But boy, this has serious consequences. So I one thing I think is that the attacks are real. The attacks on our trans brothers and sisters and theys and thems, and that's real. The attack on DEI, the attack on international and migrants and immigrants, and I don't think that's the driving. That is how politically they are holding their base together. So it's useful to sort of say, like, what's their northern light here? What's their agenda? What's the agenda behind the throne?
Right,
I think
right.
there's sort of 4 things. One is tax cuts for the rich. So that will be, and by the way, these are not things that are popular with the with the with anybody or the Trump base. Tax cuts for the rich, uh, extending the 2017 tax cuts, that's core agenda. Blocking alternatives to fossil fuel. So the fossil fuel industry, suppressing the alternatives, the clean energy alternatives, that's a clear agenda. That's the money and the movement and the interests. Deregulating the economy, to weaken the state so that corporations can govern and rule. And then this artificial intelligence stuff, which is connected to the energy. They want to basically build these huge new power plants just to power AI to replace human jobs. and the dismantling of the government, the sort of Musk agenda is very much with an eye toward replacing stuff with AI. But how are you going to power AI? You need to have nobody complaining about climate change in the whole mix, you know. So like those are like, and then there's like a huge amount of other stuff that's really just to throw everybody off balance, to, you know, attack people so that we're responding, which we need to do. But just it's useful, I think, to keep coming back and reminding others as well, what's the agenda behind this? What do they really want? And those are not things that most people want. So that I think, you know, talking to it is a time to talk to people we know who support Trump, not yelling at them, but saying, so how's this working for you? You know, I was in Dearborn, Michigan, the other day. I was like, so how's this working for us? You know, you
I'll
voted
just
for Trump.
throw in one thing here, Brad. You've touched upon the need for us to um, create and sustain an equilibrium of what we're of attention span and what we're hearing and watching and listening to. And there are many ways to do that, and we all have to figure out ways to uh, uh, find a healthy diet. But I will say, in a shameless plug, this is not why I wrote this book, but it might be that this book could offer one resource for an alternative story. And one of the most important reminders in moments like this is that this is not new. People have been struggling against this forever, deep into antiquity. And we want to be part of that mighty river of justice that's been flowing also against the stream of plutocracy. And therefore, what better time to commit? What better year to commit? For that matter, what better season with Lent coming up to commit to a discipline of scripture study and focus on Jesus' vision of a humane economy in Luke's gospel. If you all are people who are media junkies on the news, all you political geeks out there, maybe it's a good time to find a Bible rhythm and a devotional to read some ancient wisdom to keep your heads and hearts clear for this struggle. So how's that for a shameless plug? Phoebe.
Well, I'm doing it. So
That's
I'll
great. Thanks,
plug it
Brad.
as well, my friend. So
Bless you, man. Good to see you.
no, seriously. I mean, no, that's what it's anyway. I'm diving into Aramaic, biblical Aramaic, which is a whole other way, which is getting back to some of the roots of this as well. I'll talk to you about that some other time. But anyway.
Amen. Thank you, Brad. Phoebe, how about you? You got a question for Chuck? You'll have to unmute yourself and tell us where you're beaming in from.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Ted, for this, and Bartimaeus for this warm, lively gathering. And Chuck, I'm from Boston. I'm an activist inspired by liberation theology, and I was greatly moved, Chuck, by your story of your emergence from what sounds like maybe your expectations and the expectations perhaps of your family, that you would accept the inheritance. And I too had a kind of fork in the road, emerging from some of the militarism in my family at the time of the war in El Salvador, and got kind of I wanted to go on this peace walk in '92 from Panama to Washington, but I was afraid my Navy commander father would disinherit me. So it was actually, I think we loved each other more after the walk, which is kind of a mystery to me. And he didn't disinherit me, but I just wondered, Chuck, what that process might have been like for you, and what you might have seen as the challenges, what kinds of supports you had, what your questions might have been at the time, or since that similar kind of maybe process in my own life, when I see the polarization in our nation and in the world, I try to see where people might be caught. And so I'm just curious about what were the elements that freed you and perhaps um, might free others if they're aware of your story.
Yeah. Thanks, Phoebe. And I would add to that, Sally Miller in the chat raised the power of divestment and talked about that she's done a little divesting. So maybe you can include that in your response, Chuck.
Yeah, just like you, Phoebe, I was afraid of losing family connection, you know, being misunderstood as rejecting the love and the gifts that were given to me and the opportunities. And so, yeah, I had to work hard to stay connected when I went through that. And, essentially um, risk, there was risk there but I also felt like aligning what I felt was right with the life that I wanted to live would 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 ultimately free me to love even better. And I think that, and my dad is still alive, but not long after that decision where he really asked that I not undertake that action. Within a few years, he said, "You did the right thing. And now I understand." And, later I blessed this action. Didn't bless it at the time, but so, he came to appreciate as I became an adult, like, oh, this was the formative thing. This is what you had to do to make your way. And so that sort of mutual respect. But yeah, I think there's there's nothing more than to say it was more of a personal, not a political process, but um, it we're I didn't lose anything. I gained a lot,
Mhm.
fortunately.
And yet the congruence of the personal and political is precisely what makes your works have such integrity, Chuck. So it's important to keep those things united.
Thank you.
I see, thank you, Phoebe. I see Joyce Holliday and Bill Ramsey, and I want to rotate here between male and female voices. So, Joyce, nice to see you there in Maryland. Greetings.
Good to see you. So here's what I can't really get my head around, and I'm just kind of reeling because I feel like for a long, long time, includes a lot of people on this call, have been praying for the downfall of the empire and the dismantling of the government and the kind of radical change that we want. This was not the way that we wanted it to happen. But the irony for me is here we are in Maryland where 10% of the population works for the federal government. And suddenly I find myself having these great feelings of empathy for people that otherwise I would have considered a sort of enemy because of their work in the federal government. But we know people losing their jobs. And I guess it feels like it's all crumbling. And I would just like to hear, Chuck, I guess your concise vision of how can something, the crumbling, there's some good element to it, but the way it's happening is definitely not good. And how do we rebuild out of the crumbling? Like, what is your concise vision for what happens next?
Oh, Joyce, that's so. I I'm feeling a deficit of insight on to respond to that question. I just think it's a central question. I do think we're heading into the great unraveling. You know, empire, the sort of extractive market economy, we're kind of reaching the ecological limits to the kind of, we've passed a number of planetary boundaries. So, I think, and I explored this more in the novel than I have in other places. But I actually think part of the work is like the kind of relocalization of an economy, rebuilding kind of local webs of uh, community, mutual aid, culture, celebration, and that one thing I think we'll see is states a pulling apart of states even more. So within the United States, there'll be more of a, Mississippi will be really different than Michigan, will be really different than Maine in terms of what sort of people do together, what investments we make together. There'll be a polarization, and that will be part of this breakdown. So I think I'm not sure what rebuilding looks like in that sense, except at a much more regional, local level, where we have sense of a web and agency. But boy, interesting what you're saying too, just like watching, the federal government, thousands and thousands of people who are part of this infrastructure, you know, the right has always wanted to dismantle, uh, you know, a strong federal government, and they're rapidly going to be doing that. Whether, yeah, I just think trying to build out the best of that within regions. Um, I think at the 2017 tax cut, when they try to extend it, they're going to include this, state and local tax deduction. And so all of a sudden states can say, well, maybe we should tax ourselves more and spend more money in our state because we'll have more control over it than send it to Washington. That's not kind of where we want to go on everything, but I could kind of see that playing out as another form of decentralism that's going to emerge.
Thanks. Nice to see you, Joyce and Bill. Thank you. Patrick, you've been waiting very, very patiently to ask your question. I think it'll be our last question because we're right up on time, and I know for those of you in the East, it's very late, not to mention very cold. So Patrick, we're going to give you the last word on a question, but Mike Little, I want you to hang out because I want to throw you the mic after this for you to talk just for a minute about what's upcoming in Faith and Money Network. And again, I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. And stick around since you've stuck around this long. Stick around for about another 5 minutes, and we'll wrap this up in a good way. So, Patrick, briefly, what's your question, brother?
Thank you so much. You are Chuck. You're surrounded. I'm from Springfield, Mass. I'm Patrick Murray, part of the Nehemiah community here. Debbie and I moved into the inner city of Springfield, Massachusetts, about 22 years ago, and I've been working with several families in this community to work on issues of economy and racism and what have you through a biblical context. But I guess what my question is to you, Chuck, and your work, because so much of the power, especially in Christian nationalism and on this, what's driving this plutocracy right now, is now ever present in the evangelical Christian church in the United States. Are we seeing any cracks in that wall? Ted, I'll throw that out to you as well. I'm seeing some myself, even with local evangelical pastors here in Springfield, Mass. So I'm just throwing that out. If you guys are seeing any cracks in the wall where perhaps a message such as healing plutocracy and other sorts of things that are being published, books that are being published, and ideas that are being formulated might be starting to get some play in the evangelical church.
I'm going to bounce that to Ted, except to say I do see cracks in all kinds of the walls where that particularly around wealth, and that's maybe I'm just sort of positioned to see that, but the wealth managers, the wealth holders, all these sectors there are people defecting from the wealth management industry for spiritual reasons. So yeah, I see. And our job is to get our foot in that crack and make it bigger for sure. But Chet, I'm curious what if your thoughts on within the evangelical space and within.
Well, there have been a number of organizations that have been really working hard to try to crack the putative consensus on the theological right. And I would just point you to the work of Vote Common Good, which is coming out of evangelicalism. Vote Common Good. Faithful America is another organization that's really trying to recapture the gospel from Christian nationalism, and then there's a bunch of groups specifically working on Christian nationalism. There's also an African American based magazine called faithfully.org that is strongly pushing back from the Black church perspective on those who have been seduced by this this fantasy gospel. So lots of people working on it. Make it a point to connect with them locally. There are folks who consider themselves evangelicals who are pushing hard on this. And one person who comes out of that tradition and the great tradition of Church of the Savior in Washington, D.C., is Mike Little. He's on this call. He's the director of Faith and Money Network. Mike, it's come up on this call that the personal and the political need to embrace, and that means people dealing with their own money in the way that Chuck has, and that launched him on this amazing career. You all specialize in helping people walk through that process of figuring out how to share and how to do the right thing with their assets in Faith and Money Network. You want to say a word or two about what's coming up for you all?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Chad. Thank you, Chuck. Well, April 23rd, and you can go to our website, faithandmoneynetwork.org, and sign up. We're going to do a deep dive with HARP and Chad. So please sign up for that. As deep as we can go in an hour and a half. And also one of the things I've appreciated about Chuck and he's just so creative. And I don't know, Chuck, if the common security clubs that you started in 2008 or resilient circles are still going. We also are trying to take what Sabbath Economics has taught around household practices and start some household practice groups. And we have one running right now, and we can do them on Zoom, and we can encourage people to do them, around a coffee table as well. But are those still going, Chuck? Or is there?
I think they not in that current form, but they're kind of what they call mutual aid associations that took the toolbox that we created for these resilient circles. And so, yeah, I think that model of small group ministry, face-to-face, practical and personal preparation is that, I think we need to kind of revive or create new tool, kind of updated tools for small group mutual aid.
I do think that's part of the way of staying sane throughout this. And if people are interested, they can email me, Mike at Faith and Money Network. If you wanted to start a household practice, a covenant group, we can help do that. So
great. Thank you, Mike. And I hope that, Mike, you all at Faith and Money and the rest of you who have your own networks, this has been recorded, and this has been a precious conversation with one of our country's most brilliant and conscientious thinkers and organizers and educators. So we will make this available to all of you and hope that you will use it in your own circles, because this is the conversation that we need to have at the intersection between seminary, sanctuary, streets, and soil. Chris, if you could put in the link to the Kirkridge gathering, especially for those of you who are east of the Mississippi, we are going to be gathering at the historic Kirkridge Retreat Center in Northeast Pennsylvania on Memorial Day weekend in May. It's a gathering of kindred spirits. I think there might be a few spots left. It's going to be, yeah, it might be a big gathering, but it is very important to gather with kindred spirits, as Chuck was saying, small or large, to think together, to sing together, to conspire together, and to practice mutual aid. And that includes spiritual support and mutual aid. So thank you for coming into this space. Those of you who we know and love, and also a bunch of you who I don't recognize, thank you for being part of this circle. Let's, Chris, put on the big board of all the faces and let people show with their hands appreciation for Chuck Collins' work. Thank you all for your work. We are in this together, friends, and we need each other, and let us find intentional ways to connect. So in closing, I want to say as our benediction, I should check in. Chuck, any final word you want to say before we go into this good night?
No, just to say, if you're passing through southern Vermont, come visit us at the Springs Farm. It was at one time a dairy farm, but it was also a resort for the water cure. So the water is really good and healing. So
lovely.
Standing invitation, come visit.
That's great.
Thank you
Be
all.
sure and push support toward inequality.org. Many of you are already supporters of our work. We always welcome that. But most importantly, rebuild democracy from the ground up in your local area. That needs to be our great conspiracy. Let us close with how we began, which is the words of Jesus' Sermon on the Plain. It is a great vision of equity and leveling. Jesus looked upon his disciples and said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the sovereignty of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you, exclude you, revile you, defame you on account of the human one. Rejoice in that day, for surely your reward is great, for that is what their ancestors did to the prophets. But woe to you who are rich." That's an ancient Hebrew lament. "Woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who are laughing, for you will mourn and weep. Woe when all speak well of you, for that is what their ancestors did to the false prophets." Jesus, as the Quakers say, spoke plainly to his people and to his moment, and continues to do that, not least in the gospel according to Luke. Let us embrace that gospel in this year C of the lectionary. Let us embrace the great work of inequality.org and continue in our discipleship of justice. Thanks, everybody. We really appreciate you being part of this. Much love to you. If you want to hang out, Chris will unmute everybody and y'all can chatter like Babel, but we'll let you go. We started late and we went a little late. So thanks for hanging in there with us. Much love to you all.